Greetings everyone. We are here in St. Teresa's Parish, and I want to apologize for the people who were expecting the talk last night. We have some technical problems, and just we are now recording the first talk for this Advent season. I want to greet all of you who are following us in this preparation for Christmas. And especially, I want to welcome our beloved Rath team who live in our parish, and they are going to share these talks during this season. The Rath team is formed by Father David Louch, Father Tony Big Hood, and Dr. Ann Louch. She now is recovering from an accident that she had. We pray for her healing, but she will be here with us. My dear brothers and sisters, I hope you enjoy the next talks, and I hope as well you can take some ideas to reflect in this preparation for Christmas. This Advent is a season when we have to take some time to reflect about our lives, to reflect about what is going on, but as well to reflect about the people who we are reflecting from the Bible, Mary, John the Baptist, and other people who were involved in Jesus before in preparation to welcome Jesus. Let us start our first talking, leading today by Father David Louch. Enjoy and pray for each other.
Greetings, everyone. Sorry that we had to redo this. It was my fault. However, I'm happy to be back with you. What I'm going to talk about this evening is Mary, Patron of Advent. The season of Advent invites us to go more deeply into ourselves and to discover our own longing and yearning, our hopes and dreams, and maybe God's dreams for us also. Especially in its earliest days, Advent is marked by holy waiting. As the season begins, there's something about silence and allowing ourselves to be drawn into the mystery of God's loving care and God's saving plan for us. As Advent unfolds, this mystery slowly reveals itself. Historically, the revealing of God's love in Jesus began quietly and gently. It was first whispered in silence to a young woman in Nazareth named Miriam, or Mary as we say. Anne Johnson captures this sense of silence and waiting very beautifully in Miriam of Nazareth, a book of kind of Magnificat-like prayers that Mary might have spoken in different situations in her life. And I'd like to have you listen now to her prayer poem called Annunciation. In those days, when the people of Judea were oppressed in the reign of King Herod, in the town of Nazareth there was a woman named Miriam. In prayer, Miriam watched. Eyes of her soul turned inward, she watched. Ears of her spirit stretched out, she watched for Yahweh in stillness. In awe, Miriam listened. With the firm beat of her heart, she listened. With the deep stroke of her breath, she listened for Yahweh in stillness. In the stillness, Miriam reached out. Mind alive, she reached out. Memory reflecting, she reached out, inviting her God to inspire. The shadow streamed into her being, greeting the core of her soul. Hearing, she stretched for the life source, embracing the quickening call. "How is this? I know not," she responded, stumbling in God's desert of time. "But you speak, and all things come together. I will, as you say, let it be." Her lifetime of shadowy knowing was confirmed in the quieting joy. Summoning cadences ancient and deep echoed the call of God's peace. Miriam arose and went out, holding the knowledge of change, went out, accepting the newness of challenge, went out to begin the task. Miriam embarked on the journey, her mind precise for the journey, her soul inflamed for the journey, journeyed to the arms of Elizabeth. In the warmth of those arms, she knew. Ancient pathways opening before her, she knew. Words of her people streamed from her mouth, she knew that her God lived within her. I like to think of Mary as the principal patron of Advent. Mary waited with all Israel for God to fulfill his promise. After the angel's visit, Mary waited and prepared the way for the Lord in a preeminent way, in a way that only a mother can do. Mary's very body was the means by which God's promised Messiah came into the world. Even though Mary's role is unique to her and cannot be repeated or shared, still in Mary we find indications of how God acts and how we also can respond. Tomes and tomes have been written about Mary and her role in God's plan to save humanity. Pages and pages of poetry, hymnody, and prose sing Mary's praises. So much so that I never know where to start or what to say when it comes to Mary and our devotion to her. But a good place to begin is always the New Testament. I read somewhere that Mary is named 19 times in the New Testament, sometimes only passingly. So the New Testament is actually quite restrained regarding Mary. If we think of the New Testament authors in the chronological order in which they wrote, we find a sort of progressive appreciation of Mary. Paul, who was the earliest New Testament writer, and then Mark, hardly ever refer to Mary at all. Matthew speaks of Mary in the infancy narratives, but he actually focuses more on Joseph than on Mary. Luke highlights Mary's role, especially in the infancy narrative. And then the Johannine writings, the Gospel of John and the letters, as well as the book of Revelation, those writings reflect more the mystery of Mary. We see there kind of a beginning of a theologizing about Mary. So actually, at least historically, the old axiom, to Jesus through Mary, does not express the real situation. In fact, believers first discovered Jesus Christ and then Mary as the first Christian. Theologically, of course, the axiom to Jesus through Mary helps to prevent abuses in Marian devotion by keeping the focus on Jesus. I'm going to focus on two scenes from the Gospel of Luke. First one will be the Annunciation. Luke highlights Mary's role in God's loving plan of salvation, and it is to Luke's vision of Mary that the church principally turns in the time of Advent. We'll hear the account of the Annunciation several times during the Advent season. For example, last evening we heard it in the Gospel for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and it comes up a couple of other times in the course of our preparation for Christmas as well. I'd like to make a couple of comments on the Gospel of the Annunciation, more in terms of Mary as a patron of Advent. It was to an insignificant young woman in an obscure town that the word was first spoken in utter clarity. In a hidden and silent place, God broke the silence. God sent an angel to Miriam of Nazareth to announce to her that the time of waiting and watching and longing was about to end. God's love for humanity would be made manifest in a most extraordinary way. God would walk among us as one like ourselves, one of us. God would become human. And Mary would be the mother of God become human. Her son, Jesus of Nazareth, would be the revelation of the mystery kept secret for endless ages. As I was preparing this talk, I tried to spend a little bit of time in silence with Mary. What was the Annunciation and Incarnation like for her? What was it like to be the first one in whom the infinite silence was broken? What must those awesome words from the Book of Wisdom mean for Mary? When peaceful silence lay over all, and night had run the half of her swift course, down from the heavens leaped your all-powerful word. In my reading, I discovered that Carlo Corretto also tried to be in the silence with Mary. And he imagines what might have been going on in Mary's mind at the time after the Annunciation. And these are the words that he uses to try to give a sense of what Mary was experiencing. That day, I was alone in the small courtyard, and suddenly I was bathed in light. I was sitting on a stool praying. My eyes were half closed, and I felt great joy invading my whole being. The light got brighter, and I began to open my eyes, which I had closed so as not to be dazzled. Suddenly, the light took on the shape of an angel, and he spoke, "Hail, full of grace, the Lord is with you." I was very worried. It was as if I were being visited by things too immense for me and for my smallness. You can think about the things of God with great yearning, but when they touch you, you can't help being afraid. Then the angel announced my motherhood. His words were few, but so stark and clear that I felt they were springing up within me. Never before had it happened to me to hear words as if they were great events. I understood exactly what the angel was saying, yet I was amazed by the strangeness of it. For how was it possible if I was a virgin? The angel explained, and it was easy to accept what he said, for I felt I was immersed in God, as in that brilliant noonday light. I even confusedly foresaw all the misunderstandings there would be, how I wouldn't be able to explain things to my mother and still less to my fiancé, Joseph. But I couldn't have stopped myself. So strong was God's hold on me, and so strong was the conviction that came from the angel's words. For with God, nothing will be impossible. I said yes, and the angel disappeared. I saw my mother crossing the courtyard, and I wanted to tell her what had happened, but I couldn't, because I couldn't find the right words. Then I realized that there were no words with which I could explain. So as the days passed, the more silent I became. I could only keep reminding myself, I have said yes, and with God, nothing will be impossible. That's faith. Part of living in faith is getting used to living in darkness, getting used to God doing the unexpected. Imagine Mary having to believe that the baby in her womb is the Son of the Most High, having to believe that God was going to show his love for us by becoming one of us. But Mary said yes, and God needed her yes to save the world. The Annunciation can teach us about faith, about saying yes, about living with surprise. It seems to me there's a challenge in the story of the Annunciation, a challenge to believe that with God nothing is impossible, and implicit in that challenge to change, to take responsibility, to act. Because God also needs our yes, in word and in action, to continue saving the world. As we heard in that little reading from Ann Johnson at the beginning, Miriam arose and went out, holding the knowledge of change, went out, accepting the newness of challenge, went out to begin the task. Faith leads to action. We are your servants, Lord. Let it be done to us according to your word. Let your word reveal the mystery, and let the mystery of your love change us so that we can change the world. We need to think about Mary not only as the gentle, pious, quiet one, but also as faithful and strong and sharing Jesus' mission to change the world. Mary's prayer, the Magnificat, helps us to do exactly that. It was a bit of a revelation to me many years ago now, when reflecting on the Magnificat and reading a bit about it, that I realized that in the Magnificat, Mary calls for a threefold revolution. I wasn't used to thinking of Mary in such radical terms. Threefold revolution. First of all, in the Magnificat, a political revolution is indicated in the words, brought down the powerful from their thrones. And then a social revolution seems to underlie the words, filled the hungry with good things. And an economic revolution rings out in sent the rich away empty. All the social justice language that we find in Mary's prayer, the Magnificat. Jean Prévost, in his book Mother of Jesus, says this about the Magnificat. Even today, the Magnificat can continue to astonish us with its depth and its ability to inspire. Recent biblical research presents 3 reasons why we should pray the Magnificat today. The Magnificat has a community value. It is the song of all the people. Mary stands in there for the whole people of Israel through the centuries of their longing and waiting. It's a radiant proclamation of salvation and of good fortune, especially for the poor. It's a song of deliverance. And third, the Magnificat gives us an exceptional testimony about God. How God loves, how God knows us from the inside and is able to awaken in us such wonderful things. I've called Mary a patron of Advent because we see in her a certain number of virtues or attitudes that are especially apropos in the season of Advent. I've already reflected a bit on faith from the Annunciation and suggested that the Magnificat reveals Mary as a woman of justice. So two of the key Advent virtues that we can discover by reflecting on Mary are faith and justice. And I'd like to mention 4 other virtues that mark Mary especially as a patron of Advent. I'm only going to say a word about each of them, but I think it's important to note them. First is waiting. There's a tradition in the church whereby Mary has been called the Sabbath Virgin. The Sabbath, the last day of the week, is the day of rest, the day of watching and waiting. Mary waited with her people through the ages, and maybe in very special, particular way, the 9 months of pregnancy, waiting for the birth of Jesus. And then there's listening, prayer, contemplation, all those things that kind of go together. And a key line that indicates that, especially in the Gospel of Luke, and it's a line that's repeated several times through the infancy narratives. And Mary treasured all these things, pondering them in her heart. All these things, thinking through the whole history of her people, the things that she had recently experienced, things that she would come to experience. She treasured all of that and pondered it in her heart. That's how we make it our own. Third, we could talk about intimacy with God. Mary's fiat, her saying, "Yes, here I am, your servant, let it be as you have said." That's making a kind of a contract, a closeness with God and God's plan. And the words of the angel to Mary suggest an intimacy. The power of the Most High will embrace you, will overshadow you. And finally, joy. Rejoice, O highly favored one, the Lord is with you. That's a line that we hear repeated in many ways, in many places, in the prayer of the church throughout the season of Advent. Rejoice, O highly favored one, the Lord is with you. And we're always meant to recognize that Mary kind of stands in for all of us. We are all highly favored, and therefore we should all rejoice. Some time ago, I discovered an icon of Mary painted by the Jesuit William Hart McNichols. It's here beside me. It's entitled Our Lady of the New Advent, Gate of Heaven. It was commissioned in 1991 by the Archdiocese of Denver in Colorado, and it was inspired by the frequent references of Pope John Paul II to a new Advent. These references were especially relevant in the years preceding the turn of the century, which John Paul II designated as a time of intense preparation and prayer for the coming of the third millennium of Christianity. We're well into that third millennium now. The call remains with us to recognize it as a new beginning, a new opportunity for us and for God at work with us in the world. Megan McKenna, an American theologian, has collaborated with William McNichols, the writer of the icon, in publishing a book of his Marian icons with some reflections. And this is what Megan McKenna has to say about this icon, Our Lady of the New Advent, the gate of heaven. You might want to kind of keep an eye on the icon as I read, especially the first part where she's kind of referring to different aspects and dimensions of it. In the distance are the mountains, the Rockies of Colorado, snowy peaks stretching as horizon. From whence comes our help, and from whence has come good news. She who brings forth God presents her child to us. She stands open before us, her arms lifted in prayer and revelation. She brings peace. Her gaze is calming and forthright. Her robes are simple. The child born, the child to be born, is contained within her body. She holds him as a monstrance holds a host, inviting our gaze. She holds him as the heavens hold the sun, with quiet dignity and unassuming power and grace. She is the gate of heaven. She is the threshold, the doorway between heaven and earth, between the presence of God invisible and God visible, who comes to us as one of us, like us in all things but sin. The door is flung open wide, and the invitation is wordlessly sounded, "Come. Come, you whom the Father has blessed, take as your heritage the kingdom prepared for you since the foundation of the world." Here is the gentle King who comes to us bearing a scepter, the flowers of the columbine, that's the state flower of the Colorado, and with his other hand raised in a gesture of teaching, an expression of oneness, of Trinity, of wholeness and the fullness of time. She is the sunset gate of heaven. The daylight has faded, the stars come out, the years of 1 millennium have come to an end. She is the threshold between that millennium and the infancy of the present one. John Paul II called the last decade of the 20th century the New Advent, and prayed that this third millennium of Christianity be a new era of faith. But it must be more than that. It must be 1,000 years of peace and nonviolence. For in just this past 120 years, we've experienced the bloodiest and cruelest time in the world's history. Since 1900, the world killed and slaughtered more people than had been killed since the beginning of time. This faith must be as solid as the mountains and as enduring and commanding in its presence among others. But it must also be like this woman's faith, resolute, unwavering, contemplative, born of acceptance of and reflection on the long telling of the Word of God in her people's history. It must be a faith seated in promise and hope and faith of the prophets and the poor, the faith of the lowly people summoned from the beginning to the feast of freedom, of liberation and joy, and with her Son's coming in the Incarnation all the way to the table of the Eucharist. I hope some of what I've said might help you to see dimensions of the Blessed Virgin Mary that you maybe hadn't thought of or recognized before. I also hope you might spend some time with Mary in these days of Advent and deepen your relationship with her and perhaps grow in one or two of the virtues that we've noted in her. I thank you, and God bless you all.